Welcome back everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be setting up our inputs for our vehicle controller because before we actually start setting up our vehicle and moving it around, we need to actually know which buttons are going to do what actions. So for this, we're going to open up our content drawer here and we're going to go to the content folder and we're going to create a brand new folder here. Okay, so we can right click, new folder, and I'm going to call this one input. Now, inside of input, we're going to open it up, we're going to right click, and we're going to go down to where we have input and then create a brand new input mapping context. So we're going to create that and I'm just going to call this one our main input map. Hit enter and there we go. So we can then double click to open this up. And let's then dock it with our main panels up here. Now, you may be wondering what this is. Well, basically in Unreal, the way that we set up our inputs is with this input map. Basically what we do is we create things known as mappings, and each of those mappings can have different keys. So for example, if we're having a character controller, we might have a action called jump, and that jump action is triggered by perhaps pressing the spacebar. Now, for our arcade racer here, what we're going to do is we're going to have a number of different actions. We're going to have throttle, brake, handbrake, and steering. Okay, so let's go ahead and set those up. So first one is going to be throttle. So let's click on the little plus next to mappings right here. We're going to open it up, and you can see here we have none. But if we click on that, you can see here there are no actions for us to choose. So we are instead going to go to where it says create new asset, input action. Okay, we can then choose the input folder, and I'm going to call this one throttle. Save it. You can see now we have the throttle input action selected. Now, if we click on the little down arrow next to it, this is going to open up where we can set our keys. So if I click on this little keyboard icon and then press W, you'll notice that the W key has been assigned here. Now you can of course open up this drop down to then choose which key you want it to be, but pressing the keyboard and pressing it on your keyboard then is much easier. So when we press the W key, this throttle input is going to be triggered and we can then detect that over in our blueprints. Now as well, we also want another, and this one is going to be for our brake. So we'll click on the plus here. We'll create ourselves a brand new input action called brake. And this is going to be triggered with the S key. So we'll press S like so. Now, what we then also want is the handbrake. Now, the handbrake is going to be triggered with the spacebar. So we'll create a new input action here. Handbrake. We can then have the spacebar there. Now, the next one is going to be a bit different, and that is going to be steering. So if we add a new input here, create the action, call it steering. We want to have two keys change the steering value, okay? The left and right arrow key or the A and D key on our keyboard. So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all press the keyboard and press D, okay? That's fine, but we probably want to steer left as well. So how can we set that up? Well, basically we're going to add in a new action here. So we're going to click on a little plus. That's going to add in a new key event here. We're going to click the keyboard on this new one and press A. Now, what's very important is on A, we want to go down to where we have modifiers. Click on the little plus and set this modifier to be negate, okay? And negate is basically going to set this to be a negative value, because the way this works is you can think of it as each of these inputs have a value, okay? And by default, it is 0. Now, when we press a value, when we press an action, that value is going to shoot to 1. So for throttle, when we press W, that's going to make the throttle value equal 1. Brake, it's going to be 1 when we press S, and handbrake is going to be 1 when we press the spacebar. Now for steering, we don't want this to just go to 0 and 1. We also want it to go to -1. Okay, so you can think of 0 as our wheels are pointing straight, 1 our wheels are pointing to the right, and -1 our wheels are pointing to the left. So when I press D, this steering value is going to pop up to 1, okay, meaning they're going to be pointing to the right. Yet when we press A, it's going to go to 1 as well. But we have a modifier here called negate, which is going to set that to be -1, meaning they're then going to point to the left. So that is basically how we set up stuff using our input map here in Unreal. Now, as of right now, these inputs here are only going to return a Boolean value for true or false for whether or not W is held down or not. And instead, we want to convert that to a float value, okay? So instead of W returning a true or false, we want it to return a number between 0 and 1, okay? Just like I was talking before, how the values are going to change. Now, to do that, what we're going to do is we are going to open up these input actions. So if we open up our content drawer, go over to our inputs where our input actions have been created, we're going to open up throttle here by double clicking on it. And we want to go over to where we have our value type right here, okay? And as you can see, by default, it is set to digital, which is a Boolean variable, so true or false. And instead, we want to change it to an axis 1D, which is which is going to be a float. So we'll switch it over to that. We'll save that. We'll then open up our steering, also change that to an axis 1D, save that. Open up handbrake. We're going to keep this as a digital Boolean, so we'll not change that value. And then we'll open up brake and change that to be a axis 1D. Okay, so now we have finalized our inputs. And that is pretty much all the mappings that we are going to be using. Okay, throttle, brake, handbrake, steering. If you want others for maybe a pause menu or maybe a change camera menu, you can of course do that as well. But for now, we'll leave them as they are. And in the next lesson, we are going to begin setting up our vehicle. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Alright, so let's start setting up our vehicle. So what we're going to do is open up our content drawer and go over to the car folder. Now in here, you'll notice there are 3 different assets. We have a skeletal mesh, a physics asset, and a skeleton. So I'm going to go ahead and open up each of these 3 in their own window right here. So we have the skeletal mesh, the physics asset, and the skeleton. Now the first thing you're going to notice is that they all look quite similar as we flick between them, but they are all for a different purpose. So first of all, we have the skeletal mesh here, and this basically is just a look at the model itself, okay? So here we have our 3D model, the car. We have on the right hand side a list of the skeleton here, so we have all of the different bones here in the skeleton. As well as down at the bottom here, we have all of the materials that have been applied to the car, okay? So now when creating a vehicle, there's not really anything we have to do in this window specifically. So let's now move on over to the skeleton. Now, the skeleton here is basically a much more simplified version of the skeletal mesh window. This pretty much allows us to see our mesh, and on the left-hand side, we can select the different bones that our skeleton has. Now, like I said before, it's a bit weird for a car to have bones, but we are talking about bones in sort of the joint and pivot sense, okay? So you can see here we have our root bone, which is basically at the center of the car, and you can see these 4 green lines pointing off in each direction, and these are basically the bone connections. So we have 4 bones, FL, FR, RL, and RR, and these stand for front left, front right, rear left, and rear right. Now, if I select the front left here, for example, you can see that the bone is basically in the center of the wheel. Now look what happens when I rotate that bone. Okay, you can see that the wheel is basically turning, which is basically exactly what we want. We can also spin it around as well. So these bones are going to be used by the vehicle component that we're going to create later on in order to make this car, visually make it look like it's actually doing something, okay? So the wheels will be turning, they'll be spinning, and they'll also be adding in suspension, okay, based on these bone positions. Now, we're not going to go over in this lesson how to set up a skeleton for your car, but later on in the course, we will be going in Blender and looking at how we can set that up for a vehicle, okay? But for now, have a basic understanding of what each of these things are, okay? These are basically bones, which are acting as joints for our wheels to spin and turn. Now, let's go over to our physics asset. And this is the one we're going to be spending, or we're going to be focusing most of our attention on. Okay, so basically with this right here, this is basically going to be defining the physical colliders for our vehicle, okay? So by default, you can see that it's already added in colliders, but they are first of all not to scale and the totally wrong shape, okay? We have capsules for our wheels, which it's not going to make for a comfortable drive, and as well as a capsule for our car here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is over here in our skeleton tree panel, we want to click on this little gear icon and we want to go down to where we have the show all bones. This is going to basically now make the bones visible as well as these pre-made colliders. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these colliders, not the bones, and then press delete. Okay, so now we just have the bones right here. So what we're going to do first of all is create our wheel colliders. And to do this, we are going to basically select FL, FR, RL, and RR, so these 4 wheel bones, and we are going to be creating these new colliders. So to do this, we're going to go down here into our tools panel at the bottom right, and what we're going to do is we are going to set the primitive type. We're going to change that from capsule over to sphere, and then we're going to click add bodies at the bottom right. And as you can see, what that's going to do is it's going to go ahead and create these spheres for each wheel, which is basically going to act as that collider for when it is moving along the ground surface. Now, we probably also want a collider for our body here, because otherwise we'd be able to, have poles go through us in the middle. Other cars, if we have them later on, bumping into us won't really do anything. So we need a collider for our car body as well. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to select the root bone, which is basically the center of the car here. We're going to go over to our tools panel, and we're going to change the primitive type from sphere over to single convex hull. Okay, and then if we click add bodies, that is going to basically create a very simple shape here for our car. Okay, just like that. Now, the next step is going to be saving this asset, so we'll click the save button at the top left here, and we can then exit out by clicking on the X. Now, back in our main level, we aren't done just yet. There are still quite a number of things we actually need to create. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our content drawer here, and we're going to create 2 new assets. So for this, we're going to right click in the content drawer here, go to blueprint class, and we're going to go down to where with the all classes drop down and search for chaos wheel. And you should see here chaos vehicle wheel. So we're going to select that, we're going to create it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call this one our race car underscore front wheels. Now, basically what we're going to do is we're going to have a class for the front wheels and for the back. The reason why we have 2 separate ones is because the front wheels are going to behave a bit differently. For example, they are going to be steering, and later on we might also want to change, which wheels get the brake, for example. We want to create that once more, so chaos wheel, and this one is going to be called race car underscore rear wheels. Now, you can open these 2 up inside of the editor right here. Now, we aren't actually going to be modifying any of the components or anything in the graph here. Rather, we are just going to be looking at the details panel. So let's start with the front wheels here. Over in the details panel, what we're going to do is we're going to start by changing the axle type from undefined to front, because these are the front wheels. We can then change the wheel radius from 32 to 35. I've already gone ahead and figured out that this is the correct radius for our wheels, so 35 for this car, but if you have another vehicle you're using, modify this variable later on to tune it in. Then we can change other things, such as the wheel width, which we're going to keep at 20, the wheel mass, which we're going to keep at 20, cornering stiffness. Now, cornering stiffness is basically going to be how it sticks to the ground when cornering. Right now it's at about 1,000, and since we're creating an arcade racer, we probably want our car to be quite sticky to the ground, so I'm going to bump this up to, let's just say 100,000, okay? But we can, of course, modify that later on. Now, we also have our thresholds here, and a lot of this stuff we're actually going to go ahead and modify later on when we actually have our car in game and ready to test. But one more thing, and that is to go down to where we have affected by handbrake, which we're going to set to true, and affected by engine, which we're also going to set to true. So let's save this, compile it, and go over to the rear wheels. Now, inside of the rear wheels, we want to do something very similar. We're going to set the wheel radius, we're going to set the actual type first of all to be rear. We're going to set the wheel radius to be 35. We're then going to go down to cornering stiffness and bump this up as well, and enable affected by handbrake and affected by engine, okay? So we're then going to save this, we're going to compile it, and then we are going to go back into our main level, and in the next lesson, we're going to continue with setting up our vehicle. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be continuing on with setting up our vehicle. So now that we have our wheels, our skeletal mesh, our physics asset all set up, we can actually begin creating the blueprint for our vehicle. So to do this, we're going to go into the content drawer, go to our car folder, right click, and go blueprint class. Now down here in the all classes search bar, we're going to search for a wheeled vehicle. Okay, and you should see here a wheeled vehicle pawn. We're going to click that, click select, and we're going to call this one our race car blueprint. There we go. Now we can open this up, and inside here on the left hand side you're going to see two components. Okay, we have our mesh, which is a skeletal mesh component, as well as a vehicle movement component. Now the vehicle movement component is basically just a component containing a bunch of data about our car, so it is then going to be modified in order to basically be set up in the way that we want everything to be set up. There's a lot of stuff here, so we'll be going over that in just a bit. But first, let's give ourselves a model. So we're going to click on the mesh component right here, and in the details panel, let's go down to where we have the skeletal mesh asset property. Now we're going to change that from none over to our race car right here. We can zoom out and have a look at it. Okay. And as well as this, we also need a camera, because if we were to spawn this in, our camera would just, exist wherever we press play, but we want our camera to follow our car. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another component called a spring arm. And a spring arm is basically a component that connects one thing to another. In our case, that is going to be the camera. So as a child of spring arm, we're going to select spring arm, and we're then going to click add, and we're going to search for camera. So make sure that the camera component is a child of spring arm, and what you should notice is that if we select spring arm, the camera is going to be at the end of this red line. So what we can do is we can basically, in the details panel here, go down to where we have target arm length, which is basically going to be how far away the camera is from the center. So we can change that to, for example, be 900, and you can see the camera shoots out over here. We also probably want to rotate it up a bit, so we'll press E to go to the rotate tool, and then just rotate this up like so. Maybe even move it up a little bit so that the camera is looking at the top of the car, and there we go. So we now have our camera and our car working exactly how we want it. Now, also on the spring arm, we're going to go down to where we have do collision test and disable that for now. Collision test is basically going to make it so that the camera always is in visible range of the car. So if an obstacle appears in the way, it's going to move the camera closer until the obstacle is no longer in the way. Okay, you've probably noticed this in pretty much every third-person game, but we're going to disable it for now just because it might interfere with our car. So we can save that. Now, the next step is going to be compiling this, going back to our racing level, and spawning in our car to see if it actually, spawns in. So what we need to do first of all is create a game mode, and this game mode is basically going to tell Unreal what blueprint they want to spawn in as the player. So we're going to open up our content drawer here, and we're going to create a brand new blueprint class of type game mode base right here. I'm going to call this one game mode main. And what we then want to do is apply it to this level. Now, to apply game mode to a level, we simply need to go over to the details panel here, click on world settings, and then down here where we have game mode override, we're going to change this from none to game mode main. Now, let's open up that game mode main blueprint. And inside here in the details panel, we want to go down to where we have our default pawn class and change that from default pawn over to our race car blueprint. Hit compile. Save that, go back into our main level, and now finally one more thing, and that is changing our vehicle start. So you can see here we have our player start object here, and what we're going to do is basically just rotate and position it. So we're going to rotate it so the arrow is pointing in the correct direction over here. We then also want to move it back over to the start line here. Okay. We then probably also want to move it down to the ground a bit. There we go. Position it just as we want. Save it. Press play. Okay, so the reason why the vehicle is not spawning is because you can see here on our player start, it says bad size. Even though the player start is above the ground, that is still happening. Now, the reason why is because this track does not have its collider set up correctly. So if at the top here we click show and then enable collision, you can see that the track's collider is pretty big and it sort of wraps over our player start. So we need to fix that. So to do that, we're going to open up our content drawer here, go over to the track folder, and open up this track static mesh by double clicking on it. We are going to go over to the details panel here and scroll down to where we have our complex collision mesh. And we're going to set this to be the track model itself. Okay. We're also going to go ahead and enable customized collision and set the collision complexity to be use complex collision as simple. This basically means that the track here itself is going to be its own collider. So we can save that, go back to our main level, and now you can see the collision is correctly mapped onto our track here. Now we can basically disable that again so we don't see the collision, press play, and there our car is in game. Now we can't of course drive it, nothing is working, we can't even move the camera around, but in the next lesson we are going to begin setting up the blueprint for our car so it can begin racing. Now let's actually go ahead and rotate it so the arrow is pointing in the correct direction, move it over here, let's also make it sit on the ground, which it is right there, press play, and there we go, the car is now in the correct orientation. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then in the next lesson. Okay, now let's go over how we can actually begin setting up our race car blueprint. So I'm going to go over to the blueprint here, and what we're going to do is we are going to basically make it so that physics can be applied to our player. Because right now, if I press play, you notice that our car just sort of sits in the air and it doesn't move, nothing really happens. So what we're going to do is we are going to select our vehicle movement component, and we are going to go over to the details panel, and you can see there are a large number of different settings right here for us to modify. So what we're going to do is go down to where we have wheel setups, and basically this is going to define each of the wheels for our car. So I'm going to add 4 elements to this array right here by clicking on the plus 4 times. We can then open each of those up here. And you'll see here we need to give it a wheel class and a bone name. Now the wheel class is going to be either the race car front wheels or the race car rear wheels. And the bone name is going to be basically which bone that wheel is assigned to. So if we go over to our race car skeleton just to have a look, you'll notice that we have the FL, FR, RL, and RR bones for each of our individual wheels. So what we want to do is basically have that name be written out exactly as the bone is spelt, because if we don't have the right spelling, or if it's got an extra space or lowercase where it's uppercase, it's not going to be able to find the bone and there will be errors. So what we're going to do is go back to our race car blueprint, and for the first wheel we're going to set that wheel class to be race car front wheels. The bone name is going to be FL for front left. We then want to go to the next one. This is going to be our race car front wheels again, and this bone name is going to be FR for front right. We then have race car rear wheels for our RL, and then we have race car rear wheels for our RR, okay, our rear right. And that is all 4 of our wheels set up and pretty much done. So now we can close that wheel setups and continue on to the next step, and that is going to be down here where we have our engine setup. So the engine setup is going to have this thing called a torque curve. Now, a torque curve is basically going to define how much torque we're going to give our wheels based on an RPM. Now, different cars have different torque to curve ratios. Since we're making an arcade game, we're going to pretty much just keep this 1-to-1. This basically means that the amount of torque, the amount of RPM your engine is outputting can correlate to a different value in terms of wheel rotation. Okay, that just means maybe at higher RPMs you're going to have less torque, but for us, we're going to make it consistent. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the node graph right here and double click on it. This is going to open up this little window right here, and pretty much what we want to do is just right click and go add key to node, and we're just going to move it over here so it is 1 along the Y axis here. Okay, and that's pretty much all we need to do. You can go in and adjust your torque curve if you wish, but for us we're just going to keep it consistent like this. So we can now exit out of that, and the next step before pressing play is going to be adding physics to our actual car, because right now this car, as you can see when we press play, it still hovers in the air, and that's because this car doesn't actually have physics applied to it. So I'm going to select our vehicle mesh right here, and I'm going to scroll down to where we have the physics section, and where we have simulate physics, I'm going to enable that. Now we can press play, we can compile, and we can basically see if it works. And as you can see, our car falls down to the ground and the wheels wobble a little bit. Now you may notice that the camera is also wobbling with the car, which is not what we want. So what I'm going to do is on the spring arm, I'm going to select that, and I'm going to disable inherit pitch, inherit yaw, and inherit roll. So we are not going to basically have the camera rotate with the car, otherwise that can be quite disorientating. So compile that again, press play, and there you go. The car now exists here. And you may notice that when I press play, the car also gives a little wobble, and that is basically due to the suspension of the wheels. Now, in the next lesson, we are going to begin adding in some camera rotation. We're going to be adding in throttle, steering, all that cool stuff to get our car actually moving. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then in the next lesson.